Hey everybody, welcome back to the 22nd episode of Open Source for Business, brought to you by Open Teams. My name is Henry Badger, and today I talked with James McLeod, the Director of Community at Finos. James has a lot of experience from both the developer side and the community side of open source. And in this episode, we dive deep into open source communities and also enterprise involvement within those communities. Some of the topics that we cover include: what is an open source readiness program and why should enterprises have one in place? Open source program officers and the benefits of contributing to open source communities beyond the obvious things like hiring. Whether you are a user, developer, manager, or just curious about the industry, Open Teams is the place to find the information, news, training, and support you need to thrive with open source software. Now that the introductions are out of the way, let's get started. James, thanks so much for joining me on the podcast today.
Hi, Henry. It's an absolute pleasure to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
I've been looking forward to chatting with you. I know we've been talking for a while now, and I'm excited to dig into your career to begin with. So, for most of your career, you were a techie working as a software engineer. And in the last year, you shifted towards the community side of open source as the Director of Community at Finos. For those listening, Finos is a Linux Foundation community that's creating open source software solutions for financial services. So, James, can you walk us through your journey from software engineer to director of community to give us a better idea of how you actually got into open source software?
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, that's a really great question. So I've been in the industry now for over 20 years. So I graduated around 1999. And when I did graduate, I graduated as a software engineer. So I did a software engineering degree in London. And soon after that, I actually got my first role as a C++ developer working in telecommunications in a city called Reading, which is about 50 miles west of London. And it was actually in a business park that was surrounded by some of the blue chip companies like Microsoft and Oracle, and at that time, Sun Microsystems. And so my career was kind of like deeply rooted in developing for Microsoft products, which, as people on the call will know, or people listening to this podcast and webinar will know, is very proprietary. And so all of the software that we were developing was for licensed products using Microsoft Visual Studio and .NET and C++, which the people who I was developing software for had to buy, and so the actual environments were developed by Microsoft for people to develop using Microsoft software. And that continued for a number of years up until probably the mid 2000s when, JavaScript and developing for browsers and developing for the web started to, kind of come into its own. So people wouldn't install individual applications on their operating systems. They would actually look, to the web to run, software. And so I got involved in developing. I switched from C++ at that time to .NET, which it's only really kind of like a shift in environment because the way that you actually develop using object orientated techniques and patterns is actually pretty similar. But at that time, Microsoft kind of knew that there was a bit of a shift towards open source. And so they kind of said that .NET or the .NET framework was an open source, product, even though people weren't necessarily contributing to it much, from the external community. But that was kind of like my first, the first time that I had heard of open source, because at that time, GitHub didn't really exist, I don't believe. Then, as time moved on, people shifted away from actually using, at least around my circles, shifted away from using products like .NET and C# and started developing more using JavaScript. And then you got like libraries like jQuery kind of like appearing, and that's when GitHub started to appear. And it also kind of converged with social networking. So a lot more people were appearing and using Facebook to communicate with each other, and Twitter started to take off. And then people, formed their own groups around the technologies that they started to develop in order to help each other and learn and share. And this is where kind of at least for me, I'm not saying, in terms of, global open source, but for me, this is where my shift into open source started, because I quite like the fact that engineering teams and people from outside of your firm were coming together to educate each other. And so I thought, okay, I'm active on Facebook. I quite like talking to people. I had developed a few apps for Facebook in that time, because people were using playing games on Facebook then, and it was actually quite a fun kind of like social scene. And so
Farmville.
yeah, Farmville and Scrabble and all of these kind of like games. I mean, they don't exist anymore, or at least I don't think people are playing them anymore. But it was actually that whole online community kind of way of getting together with people. Um, I mean, at that time it was already up and running. But that's when kind of external communities and technology started bringing people together around coding, and so it's that whole social media meets coding, and people from different countries coming together to share code across borders, and communities of developers within cities or online coming together to teach people how to further themselves and kind of take technology forward. And so I started a meetup called React London Bring Your Own Project. And it all kind of like started from there. I joined the financial services industry, which was going through a bit of a technology transformation. And I kind of brought all of those skills of bringing people together into the industry. And that's when I became, fast forward, I'm really skirting over it now, but fast forward about 5 or 6 years, I became director of community at Finos, which is the FinTech Open Source Foundation and part of the Linux Foundation. And it kind of grew from there.
That sounds like a really interesting journey, and you've definitely seen the whole shift in attitudes at enterprises. Because I know Microsoft used to be of the mind that open source is a cancer, that infamous saying, and now they have purchased GitHub, and they are one of the leading companies today that are driving this open source ecosystem. But to focus more on your current role now, what does it entail, and what do you do as the director of community at Finos?
That is a really good question, because not a lot of people would have heard of a director of community. And in fact, when I got my role, when I started as director of community at Finos, I thought that it was actually, just really fortunate that I was able to take that role, because prior to that, I was an engineering lead at Lloyd's Banking Group. And so I had a very traditional type, job title. Um, but my role at Lloyd's Banking Group was slightly different, because I was not focused purely on developing code on my computer, with people around me kind of like fixating on one thing. My role at that time was bringing lots of engineers together across the UK, and also, across all of the various teams, in order to share code, across, the bank, rather than developing features for one particular platform or one particular product. Um, and so being an engineering lead, kind of bringing people together in, hackathons and tech sprints and, meetups, and going to events and conferences to talk about, engineering practices, was actually a pretty different way of looking upon engineering, at Lloyd's. And so whilst I was kind of trying to get Lloyd's, contribution into open source, that's when I met, my colleagues at Finos. And they said, "Hey, James, we've got a director of community role. We think that that would be a great thing for you to, focus on." And I thought, okay, I've got my meetup. I've done this type of thing before. I kind of liaise with engineers and bring them together. I'll give it a shot. And so my role at Finos is still very engineering focused, but it's kind of looking at the engineering landscape kind of across the financial services industry. So rather than focusing on one product or kind of working within one team, I join teams together from across, multiple different banks. So like Deutsche Bank, JP Morgan, Citi, Goldman Sachs, etc., Nomura, and various other Finos members to bring those engineering teams together, to cross collaborate with other technology vendors and consultancies, and also um, teach certain engineers. So there's a certain perceived barrier of entry that some engineering teams or individuals have about whether they can actually do it, because there's new skill sets that people need to know or kind of practice in order to gain their confidence. So I work within the teams, showing people how to do it, as well as, really magnifying all of the success that people are having, whilst they're doing it as well. So it's almost like I'm magnifying people's success, showing people how to do it, giving people the reason why they should be doing it, and, just trying to be as big and loud and kind of inviting as I possibly can be for that open source community.
That's really interesting. And I think director of community and community manager are roles that are really coming into play today. And a lot of companies are hiring in those areas because people are finally starting to realize how important community is, not just in the open source software landscape, but also for startups too these days. If you don't have a community surrounding your startup, then you really don't have a lifeline kind of pushing it and beating it along and selling it for you. And I think, yeah, it's really interesting that you've made that shift from engineering to the open community side of open source. But now I'd like to shift gears and focus on some of the things that you've learned over the years about open source communities and also about enterprise involvement within those communities. So, firstly, one thing that we discussed in a pre call was this idea of an open source readiness program.
Yeah.
Could you provide some advice on what enterprises should do if they wanted to start one?
Yeah, that is actually a really great question. Because, during our talk together today, we've talked about software engineering, and the practice of, laying down code or inviting developers, to contribute into open source. But actually, open source is there for, multiple people to get involved in from within the organization, because there are different groups of people who would be your open source program office stakeholders. And open source readiness is, what we need to do as, members of, that type of group, whether you have one or not, in order to bring everybody on the journey of open source. So if I take the example of, an engineer contributing code into an open repo, and when I say that, an open repo can be observed by anybody. So your code can be observed by anybody on the internet who has access to GitHub or GitLab or Bitbucket or wherever that code may land. When I'm an engineer, so if there's an engineer within your team who says, hey, I'd really like to contribute to an open source project, which means that the code that I write, will be, contributed into React.js, which is a JavaScript framework that's been written by, Facebook, or, I'd like to contribute code into Perspective, which is a JP Morgan contributed project, which has been contributed into Finos. The first thing that some people might say is, you know, does that mean that, my code will be scrutinized? Will it look bad, for the firm that you are representing? Are you going to be giving away, secrets and intellectual property? If our code is out there, does that mean that our systems will be insecure because people will be able to see, the vulnerabilities, that exist in our software? And so what open source readiness actually does, it brings together people from procurement, because sometimes when you consume open source, procurement teams like to know what software and what licenses are actually being brought into an organization, because procurement, certainly within banking, will go around multiple different vendors and make sure that the right software and the right licenses are being brought into a bank, so they can, number one, make sure that we're getting the best deal on the software. We're not signing ourselves up to terms, which you can't carry forward. You need to make sure that you can kind of like break out of certain contracts. And that is also the same for open source, because although open source is free, you've got multiple different licenses, that you can actually consume, which, for the majority of the time is an Apache 2 license, but procurement need to be involved in open source because they like to have an idea of your technology landscape that they're bringing and betting, for your firm. The other group is human resources. So human resources like to be involved in open source because when you're putting your work out there, you are representing the firm, and when you're out there representing the firm, it has a great, kind of quid pro quo for human resources because you get to attract, the engineers of the future through that contribution into open source, whether it's through code contributions or being in a special interest group, kind of giving opinion, or speaking at a meetup or speaking at an event. And so open source readiness also includes human resources because, we want to make sure that we're attracting the best talent and we want to make sure that we're, kind of representing the firm in the best way. And then as you get kind of closer to systems, you would have solutions architects, you would have cybersecurity, and probably within financial services, you'll have the policy makers and the people who represent, the regulators, etc., as part of that program office as well. Because, cybersecurity are there to make sure that everything that's being contributed and consumed is safe. And so they need to make sure that we are writing the best code, that represents the business in the best way. And we're also not, consuming code that could, include vulnerabilities. Policymakers need to make sure that, we're contributing in a way that doesn't, kind of um, uh, contradict, any rules, that have been placed, around engineering teams about, contributing into open source. Because sometimes, there will be policies in place that, restrict open source, and you need to make sure that those people, who write the policies understand the advantages and the reasons why you are kind of, making those contributions and you are consuming them. And then obviously the regulators are there to make sure that everything that you are doing adheres to the regulations that you're adhering to. And so open source readiness is about communicating in a positive way to make sure that people know that open source, doesn't contribute to vulnerabilities, kind of being consumed, and it also doesn't open your systems up to attack just because your code is, in the open. In fact, when your code is in the open, it's actually scrutinized by more people, and your engineers also put a lot more effort, into that contribution, and so it kind of increases quality and rigor. And brings out the best in your engineering teams when they know that they are writing code for their peers rather than just contributing code into a closed repo inside the firm.
So it sounds like the open source readiness program might be a precursor to setting up an open source program office. Is that right? Or is it something that, I guess, are they the same thing? Or is the open source program office more the structural integrity of an open source readiness program carried out into the future?
That is actually a really good question as well. I would say that open source readiness is for all groups to get involved in at the point in which you're starting to explore getting involved in open source. I would actually recommend that you don't do it, independently of the teams that want to contribute into open source. It's almost like open source readiness is a precursor, without, getting the backing of the stakeholders, who need to, put ticks in boxes in order for you to contribute. Without getting that, you can't contribute into open source, because there are certain things in place, within your firm that could potentially stop an engineer from doing that, such as intellectual clauses, in their work contracts, and so all of these different things need to be, explored within that open source readiness group. Um, but equally, you don't want to make decisions within that group that could actually negatively impact the engineers who want to contribute into open source in the future. And so rather than planning your open source readiness as a Gantt chart, and having a waterfall kind of like approach to answering these questions, I would actually say that the very first thing that you want to do, even before creating an open source, program office, is get together all of the groups, particularly the people who feel the strongest about open source and, kind of contributing to it and consuming it. Bring those groups together with all of the various different stakeholders, who have an opinion about it, and maybe have, a brainstorming, hour or two just to kick off, the list of requirements, so ask the question, why should we be contributing and also consuming open source? Ask people, what they need in order to be able to do that. Ask people what are the barriers, that they can, foresee that will stop them from being able to do that. So for instance, even if the people who give the okay to contribute to open source, if they say, yeah, you can do it readily, there might be certain teams with product owners and scrum masters and other people prioritizing backlogs, etc., that actually prioritize internal work rather than the open source contributions. And so you need to find those people, and the engineering teams and the solutions architects need to educate people on the reasons why open source contribution is actually really important. You may also need to bring DevOps, engineers in to talk about continuous integration and deployment, and how that can be leveraged in order to have open source as kind of like a external kind of like push from your engineering teams. And so by bringing all of those people together, you won't just be answering questions in isolation that impacts people into the future. You'll be answering all of the questions and providing solutions as one united group.
Okay, so it's really important to bring all the key stakeholders together and make sure everyone's aligned and has the same idea and understands why they are doing what they're doing. Because I know it's definitely over the last decade or so, it's become best practice for companies of all sizes to set up an open source program office. Even a study by the Linux Foundation found that 53% of companies across all industries say their organization either has an open source program office or plans to have one at some point in the near future. Based off something you said before, it's really important to know why you're consuming or why you're contributing back to open source software. Because for the companies that have made the shift from purely consuming open source to now actively contributing to the communities, what have you found to be some of the main benefits that they've reaped beyond those that are obvious, like, for example, hiring?
Yeah, okay. So that's a really good question as well. So okay, if we decided, that we didn't want to consume or contribute to open source at all, so if we belonged to a firm that was totally, believed that open source was risky, and so they put a barrier around it, um, what we actually found, in that scenario is that those firms are actually consuming open source anyway, whether they know it or not, so it might be the case that, people outside of engineering who make the decisions about, what the business gets involved in says, we don't want to get involved in open source. We don't know who the people are who are actually writing the software. They're not under any form of contractual agreement by this firm. Therefore, we don't want to take the risk on consuming their software. We can't look them in the eye. We can't prioritize their backlog. Therefore, we don't want anything to do with it. Engineering teams now would say, okay, I understand your risk position, but actually, do you realize that, if we are actually uh, if our production systems are running in the cloud, so if you're running on any of the cloud providers such as AWS, GCP, or Azure, if you're consuming or using Docker or Kubernetes, if you are writing using JavaScript and many of the JavaScript libraries that all JavaScript developers rely on in order to build software using Node, or software using any of the JavaScript frameworks for front end development, all of that stuff is open source software, and so whether you like it or not, it's very difficult for you to actually avoid, having any form of open source involvement. Even if you are running, your software using, some form of Windows server on a server under your desk, which is locked in, a cupboard somewhere, there's going to be open source software, running it on that server, even though Windows is totally proprietary. And even if you take it as far as saying, well, actually, we use mainframe servers, they're in a data center run by, an external vendor that we have total control over. It's highly likely that that mainframe server is going to be running some form of Linux kernel, and at the very core of that kernel will be open source software, because, that's where the Linux Foundation kind of like spawns from. It's kind of, the contribution of people into the Linux kernel. So even if you want to try and lock open source out of your life, it's never going to happen. Even kind of like the code editors that your developers are using are built on top of open source. It's there. And so we took that argument, or have taken that argument, not necessarily, well, I've taken the argument, in previous roles for previous firms, and have said, in order for you to have control over open source, you need to be part of that landscape. You need to be able to say that you understand it, and you need to kind of understand, the benefits of open source. So as soon as you turn that risk position around and say, actually, it's greater risk for us not to understand or contribute into open source, it's almost like you go with the flow of the river rather than trying to hold the tides back. So by saying, okay, we're going to understand open source, we're going to understand what we're consuming, all of a sudden your engineering leads are able to peer under the hoods of, the various different systems that they're consuming. They can look at the code, that these systems are actually developed, with. They can understand that some of these systems are actually written using an Apache 2 license, which means that you can start, avoiding consumer contractual tie-ins, with vendors. So if you've got one vendor who's supporting, so you can still have support contracts with external vendors. Open source doesn't mean that all of a sudden the systems belong to you. So you can have support contracts, with external consultancies who support those systems. But because those systems are open source, it means that if one support contract doesn't suit you, you can go to a different vendor, and they can support the same system, because that system is an open source system. And the only thing that you are actually engaging in is the support contract around it, rather than buying a proprietary system written by one vendor, and only that vendor can support that server or that piece of software. And then, if you throw the net, a little bit wider, it might be the case that, an engineer or an engineering lead or whoever finds a bug, within a system. Then if they fix that bug, and they contribute that bug into open source, you're not just, fixing that bug for your team, but you're fixing that bug for the world, and the people who are also consuming that system. And that's where kind of like um, the pay it forward kind of like mentality of open source starts coming in. That's where people start understanding that your firm is contributing to the success of global technology. So the more you contribute into something, the more the cycle kind of like feeds back around towards you, because your engineers are out there, they're fixing things, they're contributing things. And it doesn't even need to be code. It can be ideas, so it can be feature ideas, or it can be, you've noticed a gap, where a piece of software may be useful. They might go to a meetup and talk about it. And then you've got a self-organizing team that starts forming and starts, penciling together, how that, piece of code could come together as a project. And so it becomes very kind of organic and, self-organizing. And, that's where special interest groups and, all of that type of activity also come into play. And that's what also influences hiring as well, because engineers coming straight out of university, want to be in that team. They want to be in the team that kind of reflects, the way that people are now engaging online now, which was totally different to when, I came out of university. People engaged by going down the pub at lunchtime, but people are now
A little bit more
engaging,
fun.
no, I don't know. It's
Everyone
different
has a
though,
different idea of fun, yes.
yeah, it's different. The way that we kind of like shared ideas, it was very closed, amongst the same group of people, but now people are sharing ideas by getting onto Slack, getting onto Discord, writing comments on GitHub, tweeting things out, people go onto Egghead.io and they record their own, kind of tutorials. And then they listen to comments of people who are feeding back and they improve themselves, and the world has shifted. People come onto podcasts, and they talk about this stuff. And this is the world that, people are moving into. And this is the world that people want to be part of. I mean, you can see it with, and it's probably a little bit out there, but the way that TikTok has taken off and everybody's, kind of creating reels. The same with Instagram. You can subscribe to reels on Instagram, which are talking about JavaScript, and there's just loads of different platforms out there that people are actually getting involved in. It's not about, being in your Scrum team anymore. It's about how do you meet the world? How do you use technology to fulfill technology?
I really love your description of what the world is like now and how it is so different and just how connected everyone is. I think it's such a exciting time to be alive, and I think we're just at the beginning of seeing not only the boom of open source but just technology in general really excites me. And I think it's an exciting field to be a part of. And I know also, just on your point about open source and some of the benefits, I've learned from quite a few people that it really is about having that connection to the community, understanding how the community works, and actually contributing back to the community. Because people think, why would I pay my developer to go and work for an open source project? My competitors will have access to that, and so will many other people. But they really do. You kind of get this power and influence over the community and the direction of the community that is really important. And you've seen some of the companies like PyTorch, say, for example, Facebook is a big contributor, and there's just many other open source projects, which is larger companies are now driving and at the forefront of changing the world in the open source space.
Absolutely. And I can give you an example of where, competitors come together in order to solve a problem, both for the benefit of them and also for the benefit of a particular problem within financial services. So within Finos, we have a standard, right? So projects don't necessarily have to be, software projects that are writing code that you actually install and leverage on your Mac or on your PC or on your server or wherever it lives. It can also be standards, about how software interacts with each other, across boundaries. And that is basically interoperability. It's how do you actually pass information from one system to the next? You know, in a way that means that software vendors don't have to interpret, information in many different ways in order to transform it. So say for instance, software vendor A wants to pass software vendor B, what we call a financial object. So whether that's a payment or, some other form of example of how you actually, take that financial representation and pass it from one vendor to the next. So it could be the case that without a standard, that piece of information is represented by one vendor in one way and it's passed to another vendor in that way, but that the second vendor uses a different way to describe their financial object, and so they need to then transform from vendor A into vendor B, and that kind of transformation of that information just is very inefficient because when you're kind of passing information between two vendors, maybe that transformation is just a nuisance. But when you've got like multiple vendors, if you've got X vendors, X being a multiple, and you're having to do that multiple times, then it just becomes impossible. And so, what a standard project actually does is brings all of those vendors together who are competitors. So their software that they are writing may also be proprietary. So there's no reason why the software that those people are writing needs to be open source. It could be the case that it's a licensed product. However, it could also be the case that it has value when it's living in an environment where information can be shared about. And so we have a standards project called FTC3, which is interoperability standard, which brings all of these vendors together to say we have certain representation of financial information that's needed, but we're going to agree in the way that that is represented. So even though our proprietary product may be developed within our team because we want to be able to sell the license for that, the actual standard for how we pass information from one to each other may be in the open. So at least if we're adhering to that standard, we know that I can pass information from vendor A to vendor B to vendor C to vendor E, F, G, in a very kind of like consistent way, which adheres to that standard as well. And so by saying our competitors, will be able to see what we're doing and we're giving our secrets away, that doesn't necessarily need to be the case when you are actually getting involved in open source, because there are different types of open source activities that actually, bring advantages to that competitive market, especially when you know that those particular vendors are living in an environment like a financial desktop, where all of those different pieces of software provide different functionality, but the information that drives them is actually the same. And so, yeah, standards projects bring more efficiency even across competitors. Whereas, having close competitors, you might be able to deliver one kind of like user experience, but you might not be able to join it together with lots of different, other vendors who can bring an even bigger ecosystem, to the world. Um, Compared to if they weren't joined together in that interoperability, way.
Okay, that's really interesting. I think standards have a big role to play in growing the pie in a lot of different realms, particularly in open source too, just making it bigger for everyone by working together. Is there anything happening at Finos or the Linux Foundation that you'd like to share with those listening?
Yeah, so thank you for giving me the opportunity. So within Finos, all of the work that we actually do is continuous. All of the projects, within open source are running as you would expect an internal project to run. So if you want to get involved in any of those projects or understand more about them, if you go to finos.org, that's the foundation website where you'll be able to find our news and events, and everything that's happening. And you'll also be able to get pointers to github.com/finos, which is our open source organization, where you'll be able to see where all of the engineers and projects actually live. And like I said before, you can actually explore all of those repositories and see the code that's in there and, all of the various different project documentation. This year we have the Open Source Strategy Forum, which is the Finos conference, and there's currently a call for papers out. So if there's anybody who either wants to attend the Open Source Strategy Forum or would like to put an idea for a presentation that you would like to give, please feel free to find me on LinkedIn, where if you search James McLeod Finos, you'll be able to find me. Or you can find me on Twitter at twitter.com/McLeod, but there's an underscore between the O and the D. So it's MCLEO_D. And also, come and find me if you want to find out more, and maybe I've not spoken about it, during this podcast, because open source is so broad. It kind of covers consumption and contribution. If you've got any questions, please do reach out and find me. We have a Finos Slack. I can invite you there, and we can, have a chat, or we can jump on a Zoom.
Awesome. Well, yeah, thanks so much for your time. It's been great chatting, and I'd love to get you on the podcast at some point in the future too.
Perfect. Thank you very much for inviting me today, Henry. It's been really great being here with you, and I hope things are good where you are.
They are good, and likewise on your end. And for everyone listening, thank you for tuning in. If you like what you listened to today and saw something that maybe heard something that maybe a friend would like, then please share this with them. It really does help to get the podcast out there. And the aim of this podcast is really to educate C-level managers at companies that use open source to better manage open source technology. So with that, we hope that open source can thrive. Thanks everyone. Thanks James, and until next time, see you.